The morning after the reading of the will, Eleanor Wycliffe stood in the long gallery of Thornfield Court and listened to a man tell her, in the level voice of someone discussing the weather, that she was a temporary arrangement. The candles had not yet been snuffed from the night before, and the cold December light came thin through the tall windows, falling across the marble floor, where she had walked these past 2 years as governess to a child no one else had wanted. She wore the same gray wool gown she had worn to the funeral, neat at the cuffs, mended once at the elbow in a stitch so careful no one ever noticed, and against the gilt in the oil portraits and the great cold mantle she looked exactly like what the house had decided she was. A woman who could be sent away. A woman who could be replaced. She was 23 years old, and she had buried her own father 18 months past. And she had learned by then that the world informs you of your unimportance in a particular tone, soft and reasonable, the tone of a man who has never once had to wonder whether he mattered. The man speaking was Marcus Ashby, the new Duke of Hartwell, cousin to the old Duke, whose body had gone into the family vault 4 days ago. He had arrived from the north the evening before, tall and still in a way that filled a doorway, his coat the deep navy of a winter sea, his face composed and unreadable above a plain white cravat. He had not raised his voice once. That Eleanor would think later was the cruelty of it. He had told her she was replaceable the way one tells a footman to bring more coal. If this story finds you somewhere quiet tonight, stay a while. What the Duke did not yet understand was that some women do not argue. They simply gather their dignity and go. What he had said precisely was this: that the household would be reorganized, that a child of 7 could not be educated indefinitely by a woman without references of standing, that there were a dozen governesses in London, with proper letters, who could take the position within the fortnight, that Eleanor's arrangement with the late Duke had been informal and would not be considered binding. He said it standing near the window with his hands behind his back, looking not at her, but at the frost on the glass, and he said the word himself, the word she would carry out of that room: replaceable. He said the position was a replaceable one, and that she ought not to take it personally. She did not take it personally. She took it precisely as it was meant, which was worse. Eleanor inclined her head, the small correct bow of a servant who has received an instruction, and she said, "Only, I understand, your grace." Huh. Then she turned and walked the length of the gallery, past the portraits of Hartwell men who had all worn that same composed face, and she did not hurry, and she did not slow. And she was through the far door and gone before he had finished the sentence he had begun about the terms of her notice. He was still speaking when the door closed. He heard it close. He turned from the window and found the room empty, and for the first time in a long while the Duke of Hartwell did not know precisely what had just happened. To understand why she left before he finished, you must understand what the late Duke had given her, and what it had cost her to be worth giving it to. Eleanor had come to Thornfield Court in the autumn of her 21st year. 3 months after her father's death had revealed that a country curate leaves behind sermons and debts and very little else. The position had come through a friend of a friend, a half-charitable arrangement. The old Duke of Hartwell, a widower in his 60th year, had a grandchild on his hands, a small, silent girl named Cassandra, whose own parents had died of fever within a week of each other, and the child would not speak, would not eat at table, would not be touched. 3 governesses had come and gone before Eleanor. The old Duke had looked at her across his study with the exhausted eyes of a man who expected nothing, and he had said she might try, and that he doubted it would answer. It had answered. Not quickly. For the first month, the child Cassandra had watched Eleanor the way a wounded animal watches the door of its cage, and Eleanor had not pressed her, had simply sat in the schoolroom each morning and read aloud whether the child listened or not, had left a slice of bread and honey at the child's elbow each afternoon and removed it untouched each evening without comment. On the 19th day the bread was gone. On the 40th day the child sat beside her on the window seat. By spring, Cassandra spoke haltingly, then freely, and by summer she laughed. and the old Duke had come to the schoolroom door one afternoon to find his granddaughter teaching Eleanor a clapping game, and had stood there a long moment with his hand pressed flat against the frame. That was the worth no one wrote into a letter of reference. That was the thing that could not be replaced, though the Duke of Hartwell, 4 days a duke, did not know it yet. The old Duke had grown fond of her in the grave, undemonstrative way of old men. He spoke to her of his late wife. He gave her the run of the library. 10,000 volumes she devoured by candlelight. And once, near the end, when the physician had begun to come daily, he had pressed into her hand a small object wrapped in a square of linen, and told her to keep it, that it had been his wife's, and that he wished it to belong to someone who understood what it was to love a thing quietly. It was a miniature, a portrait the size of a coin, of a young woman with a grave, sweet face, set in a worn brass case that had been opened and closed so many times the hinge had gone soft. Eleanor kept it in the pocket of every gown she owned. She had it on her the morning the Duke told her she was replaceable. Her hand had closed around it in her pocket as he spoke. And that was the only thing that had betrayed her, the white of her knuckles, inside the gray wool where he could not see. The house. To the house. She had always been just a governess. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, a stout gray woman who missed nothing, knew otherwise, and the child knew otherwise, and the old Duke had known. Yet the world that mattered, the world of callers and cousins and the county, had decided Eleanor was a plain provincial woman of no family, who had attached herself to a great house, and it said so. The vicar's wife had said it at the funeral, behind a black-gloved hand loud enough to carry. "The little governess," she had murmured to her neighbor in the second pew. "Such a pity for her. She will have to find another situation. Now, poor thing. They always do land somewhere." Eleanor had heard it. She had kept her eyes on the coffin and her hand on the miniature in her pocket. And she had thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she was very tired of being a thing that landed somewhere. She went, that morning after the will, to the schoolroom, because she would not leave without telling the child herself. Cassandra was at the window with her slate, drawing the bare elms in the park, and she looked up with her whole face the way she did now, the way she had not done 2 years ago, and Eleanor's resolve nearly failed her there. She knelt by the window seat, and she told the child, gently, that she would be going away soon, that a new teacher would come who would be very kind, that Cassandra was clever and brave and would do beautifully. The child did not cry. That was worse than crying. She looked at Eleanor with the old shuttered look returning behind her eyes, the door of the cage swinging closed again, and she said, "He sent you away." Not a question. Eleanor said that it was no one's fault. The child said, "I will not speak to him," and bent back over her slate and pressed the chalk so hard it snapped. The new Duke, meanwhile, had begun to discover the dimensions of what he had done, and he had done it. He would come to understand, without knowing the first true thing about the woman he had dismissed. He had not meant to be cruel. Marcus had inherited a dukedom. He had never expected and did not want. A vast cold pile of stone and a tangle of debts and tenancies and a small niece he had met for the first time at the graveside, and he had arrived at Thornfield braced for everything to be a problem requiring management. The governess had seemed on the ledger of his first evening a loose thread, an informal arrangement, no contract, a young woman of no connection. The efficient thing was to regularize it. He had said what he said because it was true on paper, and because saying difficult things plainly was the only mercy he believed in, having been on the receiving end of so much soft dishonesty in his life. He had expected her to weep, perhaps, or to plead or to bargain. He had a small hard speech prepared for each of those. He had not expected, "I understand, Your Grace," and a closing door. He had not expected the silence she left behind to be the loudest thing in the room. That afternoon he found the schoolroom by accident, looking for the library, and he stopped in the doorway because the child was there, his niece, the small grave girl from the graveside, and she was sitting very straight, with a snapped piece of chalk in her fist and tear tracks dried on her face, though she was not crying now. And when she saw him, she stood and walked to the far corner, and turned her back to him, 7 years old. She turned her back on a duke and stood facing the wall, and Marcus, who had commanded men and managed estates and stared down creditors without a flicker, stood in the doorway of a child's schoolroom and felt something he could not name move through him like cold water. "Cassandra," he said. The child said nothing. On the slate by the window he saw a drawing, careful and exact, of 2 figures by a window, a tall woman and a small girl, and beneath it, in a child's painstaking hand, a single word: Eleanor. He learned her name from a slate. He had dismissed her without ever once using it. He crossed the room slowly and crouched by the window seat, his great frame folded down to the level of the drawing, and he looked at the careful elms and the 2 figures and the single painstaking word, and he did not touch the slate, because some instinct he had long starved told him it was not his to touch. The child kept her back to him. He could see the small, rigid shoulders, the dark hair pinned by someone with patient hands, and he remembered, with a sudden unwelcome vividness, another small back turned to him across the years, in another cold house, a sister he had told to be sensible. He stood. He left the schoolroom quietly. In the corridor he stopped and put one hand flat against the cold paneling and stood a moment, as the old duke had once stood against a doorframe, and felt the house settle its long judgment on him. That evening he sent for Mrs. Pruitt, and the housekeeper came and stood before him with her hands folded and her chin level, and she answered his questions in the fewest words that civility allowed, and her disapproval came off her like heat off a stove. He asked how long Miss Wycliffe had been in the house. 2 years and 3 months, your grace. He asked whether the child had improved under her. The housekeeper looked at him for a long moment. The child did not speak when Miss Eleanor came, she said. Not one word, for near 2 months. The old duke had given up hope of it. Now she reads aloud of an evening, and beats me soundly at spillikins. A pause. Your grace asked whether she improved. I would say Miss Eleanor gave her back to us. Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, because he was a thorough man, and the question was on the ledger, whether Miss Wycliffe had family or means to go to. And Mrs. Pruitt said, in a voice gone suddenly cold, none, your grace. Her father was a curate and left only debts. She has a few pounds put by from her wages and the clothes she stands in. You have turned out a woman with nowhere to go 4 days before Christmas, and you called the position replaceable, where the child could repeat it to me, word for word. If your grace wishes to know the truth of the house, that is the truth of it. She curtsied and withdrew. Marcus sat alone in the cold study with the fire burning low and the ledger open before him, and he did not look at the ledger. He found her the next morning packing because she had not gone yet because there was no coach until the day after, and the snow had begun. She was in the small, bare room under the eaves that had been hers, folding her few gowns into a single trunk, and she did not turn when he appeared in the doorway. Your grace, she said to the trunk, I will be gone the morning after next. You need not have troubled to come up. I came to ask you to stay. Her hands went still on the gray wool. She did not turn. You told me I was replaceable. Your grace, one does not ask the furniture to stay. It landed. He saw her shoulders, the set of them, and he understood that she had heard the word as he had not meant it, and exactly as he had said it, and that there was no taking it back by explaining what he had intended, because what he had intended did not matter beside what he had done. He had learned that lesson once before, long ago, and had built his whole, cold, careful life around never having to learn it again, and here it was again in a bare room under the eaves, taught to him by a governess folding a mended gown. Miss Wyke, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and she heard it, and her hands tightened on the wool. I was wrong. I spoke of a position. I did not know there was a person in it. I am asking you to stay because the child will not speak to me, and because I am told that you gave her back to us, and because a man who has just learned the cost of a careless word would be a fool to compound it with a careless silence. Stay. not as an informal arrangement. As her governess, properly with a contract and references in my own hand, for a long moment, Eleanor did not move. Then she turned, and her eyes were dry and very steady, and she said, "Why does it matter to you whether the child speaks?" The Duke of Hartwell, who never explained himself, who had buried whatever lived under that composed stone face so deep he had nearly forgotten where, stood in the doorway and told her the thing he had told no one. "I had a younger sister," he said, "Anne. When I was a young man and our parents died, she was left in my charge, and I was cold to her because I believed that softness was a weakness I could not afford. I told myself she was provided for, that feeling was not required, that I had discharged my duty. She went into a marriage I might have prevented had I been the sort of brother a girl could speak to. She died of it, of a fever in a house far from anyone who loved her, and I learned that she had been unhappy for years, and that she had not written to me because she did not believe I would care to read it." He paused. The level voice did not break, but it had gone somewhere. It did not usually go. "I came here braced to manage a problem. I find I have a niece who has just turned her back to me at 7 years old, exactly as I deserve. And the only person she has ever trusted is a woman I told to her face that she could be replaced. I am not a man who feels things easily, Miss Wycliffe. I know now, though, what it costs to be cold to a child in your keeping, and I will not pay that price twice." The miniature in Eleanor's pocket seemed to grow warm against her hand. She understood, in that moment, a great deal that had been hidden, and she understood, too, that the cold she had taken for cruelty had been a wall around a wound, and that the man before her had just, for the first time perhaps in many years, set a stone of it down. She agreed to stay, not for him, for the child, she told herself, and it was half true. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Eleanor's life, because she watched a cold man learn to be warm, and pretended not to. He came to the schoolroom in the evenings, awkward as a soldier in a nursery, and sat in a chair too small for him while Cassandra read aloud. And for a long time the child read past him as though he were a piece of furniture, repaying him in his own coin. He did not force it. Eleanor had taught him that without a word, simply by being the example in the room, for he watched how she waited, how she left bread at an elbow and made no comment, how patience was a thing you spent without expecting change. One evening Cassandra, reading a passage about a knight, came to a word she could not manage, and without looking up she held the book toward the only adult who had not failed her. And it was Marcus the book was held toward, and he leaned in and said the word "lo," and the child took the book back and read on. And a thing in the room shifted that none of them spoke of. Eleanor's body had begun to betray her by then, in the way the old narrators of such houses would have recognized. She knew where he was in a room without looking. When his hand brushed hers, passing the ink pot, she felt it climb her arm like warmth from a fire. She told herself it was nothing, that she was a governess and he was a duke, and the distance between them was a law of nature, and her hand on the miniature in her pocket said otherwise. And she did not listen to it, because she had been told once already in that house what she was worth, and she did not intend to be told twice. He told her she was not replaceable on a Tuesday, in the library, and did not say it in words. It was the evening the snow had stopped, and the moon came hard and white through the tall library windows. She had come down for a book after the child slept, and found him there at the great desk, and they had fallen into talk, as they did now, the careful talk of two people who have agreed not to notice that they seek each other out. He had asked her, that evening, what she would have done with her life, had her father lived and left her means, and she had told him, surprising herself, the truth, which was that she had wished to keep a school, a small one, for girls with no one, that she had a notion children learned best when someone simply refused to give up on them. She had never said it aloud. He had listened with his whole still attention, the navy of his coat black in the moonlight, and when she finished he had said nothing for a moment, and then he had said, very low, "The Duke who held this house before me used to say the truest things in a room go unsigned and unpaid. I begin to understand him." And he had looked at her in a way that made the word replaceable impossible, made it absurd, made it a thing said by a stranger who no longer existed. And Eleanor had felt the whole architecture of her composure tremble. She had risen and said good night, and gone up too quickly. And she had stood with her back against her own closed door, and her hand pressed flat over the miniature and her heart going like a struck bell. And she had thought, "This is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me." The danger had a name, and the name arrived by coach the following week, in diamonds, with a chaperone, and a lady's maid, and a great quantity of trunks. Lady Sophronia Vance was the daughter of a marquess, and the choice that the family, in the persons of the late Duke's sister, the Dowager Lady Margaret Hartwell, had selected for Marcus before he had been a duke, a fortnight. The Dowager descended on Thornfield, with Lady Sophronia in tow, and a campaign already mapped, because a dukedom required a duchess of suitable rank, and a niece required a proper mistress of the house, and a governess of no family who had been seen walking the gallery with his grace at an unsuitable hour required, above all things, to be put back in her place. The Dowager was a handsome, upright woman of 60, whose every word was calibrated to the precise inch of a person standing, and she took Eleanor's measure in a single downward glance the first evening, and found her, as she found all things below a baron, beneath notice. "The governess may bring the child down to be presented after dinner," the Dowager said to Mrs. Pruitt, in Eleanor's hearing, in the front hall, as though Eleanor were not standing 6 feet away. "And then she may take it up again. We do not require the help at table. I cannot think what my late brother was about, but his eccentricities need not become ours." The help! It was the second voicing of the thing, in a new mouth and a new room, and it landed precisely where it was aimed. Eleanor brought the child down and took the child up and said nothing. And at the table that night, Lady Sophronia laughed her silver laugh at the Duke's elbow, and laid her white hand on his sleeve. And the Dowager watched with the deep satisfaction of a general whose lines are holding, and Marcus sat at the head of his own table looking. Eleanor thought from the doorway where she stood with Cassandra's hand in hers, like a man being measured for a coat he had not asked to buy. She might have read the whole thing wrong, through the old wound, the way the narrators warn. She very nearly did, because what she saw was the diamonds and the rank and the white hand on his sleeve, and what she told herself was that the moonlit library had been a kindness she had mistaken for more, that a duke marries his equal, that she had let herself forget for 3 foolish weeks exactly what she had been told plainly on her first morning of him. She withdrew. She kept to the schoolroom. She was correct and cool, and present only when summoned, and Marcus, who did not understand what had changed, grew correct and cool in answer, and the distance between them filled with a silence that the Dowager mistook for victory. If you have ever watched 2 people who love each other agree, separately and in good faith, to give each other up, you know how quiet it is. Stay with me. It does not stay quiet. The Dowager moved to finish it at the Hartwell Ball, the first great entertainment of the new Duke's reign. The whole county invited, the ballroom of Thornfield Court lit with 1,000 candles, and the long windows black and gleaming, and the orchestra tuning in the gallery above. It was to be the night Lady Sophronia was, in all but the announcement, established as the future Duchess, and the Dowager, who believed in tidiness, had decided that the governess should be removed from the board entirely before the dancing began. She did it in the card-room before a dozen witnesses, with the velvet precision of a woman who has never once been told no. She summoned Eleanor on a pretext, the child's bedtime, and when Eleanor came she found the Dowager seated in state, with Lady Sophronia at her hand, and the county's chief gossips arranged like a jury. "Miss Wycliffe," the Dowager said, pitching it to Carrie, "you will be leaving us in the new year. I have written to a family in Yorkshire in need of a governess, and given you such character as I can. It is best for the child and best for the house that arrangements with persons of your sort be kept to their proper term. My nephew is too newly come to his position to attend to these niceties, so I have attended to them for him. You understand me. You are not the first young woman to mistake a great house for a home, and you will not be the last. You are, in the end, a replaceable thing, my dear. And the kindest service I can do you is to say so plainly." There it was. The third voicing, in the third room. Before the largest crowd, the word come round again like a bell tolled 3 times. And this time, it was meant to break her in public. And the card room went silent. And the gossips leaned in, and Lady Sophronia smiled down at her fan. And Eleanor Wycliffe, who had left a duke before he finished his sentence, looked at the dowager and did not leave. She had a child upstairs who had learned to speak. She had a miniature in her pocket, given by a man who had known her worth. She had spent 2 years learning that dignity is not the absence of being struck, but the refusal to strike back from the gutter, and she lifted her chin and said, in a voice that carried as clearly as the dowager's own, "I will go where I am sent, my lady, as I always have." I will not agree, though, that a person is a thing. The late Duke did not think so. He gave me something of his wife's, and told me it should belong to someone who understood what it was to love quietly. I have tried to be worthy of that. You may send me to Yorkshire. You cannot send me out of my own good opinion of myself. And that, my lady, is the one possession you have never been able to take from anyone." She curtsied perfectly and turned to go, and the card room was no longer silent in the way the dowager had intended. What Eleanor did not know, going up the stairs with her heart slamming and her eyes burning, was that Marcus had been standing in the doorway behind her for the whole of it. He had come to find her himself about the child. He had heard his aunt call a woman a thing in his house. He had heard Eleanor refuse the word without raising her voice, the way she had refused him on his first morning, and he had understood at last, fully, the shape of what he had nearly thrown away, and what his aunt was throwing away for him. And he found that the cold, careful silence he had built around himself for 20 years had simply, in that doorway, ended. The ball was the same arena where the verdict had been given, and it was where he overturned it. He did not do it in the card room. He did it an hour later in the ballroom, before the whole county, at the worst possible moment for tidiness and the best possible moment for truth. The dowager had just brought Lady Sophronia forward for the first set, had just begun the slow public choreography by which a future duchess is shown to a room, when Marcus Ashby crossed the floor. He did not cross it to Lady Sophronia. The orchestra had begun and faltered as people turned. He walked the length of that bright, cold room, past his aunt, past the diamonds to the foot of the stairs, where Eleanor had paused with the sleeping child finally settled, and had come down for one last look at a life that was ending, and he stopped before her, and the whole room stopped with him. "Your Grace," Eleanor said faintly, "the child is asleep." "I was only Miss Wycliffe," he said, and his level voice carried to every corner of that silenced room. "Marry me," 2 words. He had spent his life in the economy of cold speech, and he spent the whole of it now in 2 words, and they fell into the silence the candles had built and lay there, irrevocable, while 1,000 flames burned and the orchestra held its breath and the dowager's fan stopped halfway to her face. No one moved. Eleanor's hand had gone to the miniature in her pocket. The dowager rose from her chair, her color high, her voice for the first time in 60 years uncertain at the edges. "Marcus, you forget yourself. You forget what is owed to your name, to your position, to this family. That woman is a governess. She is nothing but," and she reached for the word that had served her all her life, the word she had told 3 times, and found in front of the whole county that it had stopped working. She is nobody. She is the only person my brother's grandchild trusts in the world, Marcus said, not loudly, not cruelly, turning so the room could hear. She came to a silent child everyone else had given up and gave her back her voice. She buried her father and her own prospects, and asked nothing of this house but to be allowed to do good quietly in it. I told her on my first morning here that she was replaceable. I was 4 days a duke and a fool of much longer standing. And I have spent every day since learning that it was the single most untrue thing I have ever said." He turned back to Eleanor. The composed face was not composed now. "I do not want a duchess of suitable rank. I want the woman who left before I finished talking, because she would not stay to be told she was nothing, and she was right not to. Stay now. Not as a governess. As my wife. There is no one on this earth who could take your place, and I will say so in front of anyone who cares to hear it for the rest of my life." The dowager sat down. She sat down slowly as a building settles, and Lady Sophronia, who was not a stupid woman, gathered her diamonds and her dignity and stepped back into the crowd, and somewhere near the orchestra, an old woman who had been the late Duchess's friend began very softly to weep, and the county, which had come to watch a governess put in her place. Found that it had instead watched something it would be telling its grandchildren about, and did not know whether to be scandalized or moved, and chose, as crowds do, when the truth is plain enough to be moved. Eleanor stood at the foot of the stairs with her hand on a dead woman's portrait, and her whole body singing the answer her mouth had not yet given. She looked at him a long moment. Then she said quietly, so that only he and the nearest witnesses could hear, "You told me one does not ask the furniture to stay." A pause, and the smallest possible breaking of her own composure, which was the most that she would ever permit a room to see. "You will have to ask the woman Eleanor," he said her given name, in his voice in front of them all. "Stay." She stayed. They were married quietly in the spring, in the small stone church in the village, with the snow gone and the elms in the park coming green, and the Dowager Lady Margaret was present, because the Dowager understood when a thing was finished and had the breeding to be gracious about it. And over the months that followed she came, in her stiff way, to a kind of peace with the niece by marriage. She had called nobody, and once, near the end of the first year, was heard to remark that the child had grown remarkably, and that perhaps her late brother had not been so eccentric after all. It was as near to an apology as such a woman could come, and Eleanor, who had never wanted her humbled, only corrected, accepted it as it was meant. The school came too, in time. Marcus gave her the old dower house at the edge of the park, and the funds to fit it out, and Eleanor kept a small school there for girls with no one, 6 of them at first, then 12, and the village grew used to the sight of the Duchess of Hartwell walking the lane each morning with a child on either hand. She did not stop being the woman who had taught a silent girl to speak. She had only stopped being told that it did not count. On a winter evening, a year on from the morning, he had called her Replaceable. Eleanor sat by the fire in the drawing-room of Thornfield Court, in the warm wood and candle glow, while the snow came down soft and steady against the tall black windows she had once crossed in a mended gray gown. Cassandra lay along the hearthrug with a book, reading aloud, her voice clear and unhurried, stopping now and then to show a picture to the great patient man who sat in the chair beside his wife, and listened to a child read as though it were the only business in the world worth attending to. On the small table at Eleanor's elbow lay the miniature in its worn brass case, taken out of her pocket at last, set where the firelight could reach it. The grave, sweet face of a woman long dead who had loved someone quietly and had, through a chain of small kindnesses she never lived to see, brought all of them home. Eleanor reached over and closed the soft old hinge, gently, the way one closes a door on a room where everyone is finally safe. The fire settled. The snow fell. No one in that room could be replaced by anyone, and all of them at last knew it. If Eleanor's leaving, and her staying, moved you tonight, stay a moment longer in the quiet of it, and carry it with you. Thank you for staying until the end.